It's a great pleasure to talk to Gillian Tett, who is just transitioning, as they say nowadays, from one role to another, not leaving the Financial Times, but spending more of her time with us in King's College. So welcome to King's.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you, and even more delighted to be here.
Great. Well, we'll talk later about your life and so on, but I want to just take you through some of your memories and thoughts, reflections. It's very early still, but about your time with the Financial Times, and I realise it's an anniversary. As you perhaps know, it's 30 years this year that you joined the Financial Times. The first thing to clear up is something you said in Wikipedia, which was that you joined the Financial Times because you decided that academia was a dead-end intellectual endeavour.
No, I didn't say it was a dead end. I said I was frustrated with anthropology because it seemed to be committing intellectual suicide.
That's the word. Those are the words.
And the reason I said that was because at the time that I was doing my anthropology, there had been a huge explosion of reaction against previous decades of anthropology, where people had, attempted to make sense of societies in a systematic way, whether it's functionalism or structuralism or whatever ism you want to have. There was an assumption that anthropologists could say something useful about the world. And then when I went to study anthropology, there was a real backlash against the idea that anybody had the right to say anything about anybody else. And anthropologists spent so much time deconstructing their craft and saying why they had no right to say anything about other cultures.
Oh, I see. It was postmodernism.
It was postmodernism writ large, and it seemed to be as if they were constantly defining themselves out of existence.
Yeah.
And so that was one of my big problems.
See. Well, I totally agree with you, but I thought it was because you didn't think there was a career there.
No, I didn't. It wasn't. I didn't think there was a career there at all. It was because I was frustrated with the lack of self-confidence in the discipline.
Yeah.
And that was one of the key problems.
Okay. So, take us through the stages of your time with the Financial Times. At first, you just joined as a junior employee. Is that right?
Well, what happened was, while I was doing my fieldwork in the former Soviet Union, I wrote a couple of pieces freelance while I was still doing my fieldwork, and then I asked if I could have a internship at the Financial Times in the summer of 1990. And I went there to sit on the foreign desk of the FT just purely by chance. And while I was there, I spent the first week making the coffee. And the second week, the Soviet Union, the first Soviet coup happened. And it was August. I was the only person in the entire building who spoke Russian. And so I was suddenly asked to call up all of my contacts in the former Soviet Union and to try and gather some material for the story. There was absolutely nobody else around. And then I used my PhD work to write an article for the FT about nationalism. And on the third or fourth day, the foreign editor at the time, who was called Yurek, suddenly came out of his office and yelled across the news desk, does anyone here want to go to Lithuania tomorrow? There's going to be a revolution. And I put my hand up and said, I'll go, and I speak Russian. And he said, okay, great. And literally he gave me $1,000. There was no visa because the Soviet Union was breaking up, and so no one knew how to get a visa. I had to fly to West Berlin and then go across West Berlin to East Berlin in a taxi because the airports were not connected. Flew into Vilnius in Lithuania. I was almost the only person on the plane. And when I landed, they said, where's your visa? And I said, well, Lithuania has just declared independence, give me a Lithuanian visa. And they wrote a piece of paper with me, and I came back 8 months later.
8 months, gosh.
And I just kept moving. And I basically turned myself into a war reporter come foreign reporter just by sheer, default. And after that, I came back to Cambridge and said, I know you thought I was doing a PhD, but actually I've been a war reporter for the last 6 months, but I'd like to finish off my PhD now. So they said fine, and I came back here and spent a few months here. And then I applied for the Financial Times graduate trainee scheme and was accepted as a graduate trainee. Mm-hmm. So I joined the FT as a very regular graduate trainee and put the PhD aside for what turned out to be 2 years. Mm. And I went through the regular graduate trainee program. I got sent down to, it was 1993, so the British economy was in a recession. So in fact, I was the only graduate trainee. They'd cut the graduate trainee program. They sent me to a regular journalism training school in the south of England, which was basically mostly local journalism, and it was full of people learning shorthand and local law and things like that, which I did for 5 months. It was not a very happy experience because I had just come back from the Soviet Union. I was keen to do war reporting. I was very young, very naive, very full of myself. Not full of myself, but very determined and passionate to do things. And I became very angry because the supervisor of the training course was sexually harassing a lot of the girls. Not me, but the other girls. And since I was the only person on the entire course who didn't depend on his letter of reference to get a job, I decided to challenge him. And I did so in a rather stupid way. I should have just reported him to a supervisor, but I challenged him directly. So I got thrown off the course and had to go and explain to the FT why I'd been expelled. And the FT in those days decided to cover the whole thing up and basically hired me anyway. And I became an economics reporter. And I basically did the classic journalism training apprenticeship for the next few years in the economics team.
What was the difference between being an academic anthropologist or an academic and doing a PhD and journalism? What are the sort of main differences between them?
The main difference is the speed of thought and action and writing, obviously. The fact that information and knowledge is not studied for its own sake, but usually as a means to an end, which is to tell a story and communicate an idea or an event or an explanation of the world as quickly as you can. And it's also, it's a big, competitive, fast-moving organization, and you are constantly having to make big compromises as a journalist about the world.
And what kind of compromises?
That if you are going to write at something about Tajikistan, as an academic or an anthropologist, you'd spend, a year studying it very slowly and beautifully and absorbing the information and thinking about how to write it and basically trying to do so in a very careful way. If you're a journalist writing about Tajikistan, you might have the luxury of having a week to study it, possibly 2. You might have the luxury of having a week or 2 to write the piece, but that's a luxury. Often you have to produce what you're writing in a day, and inevitably, because you're writing to a short framework and you're trying to communicate with people who are busy and know nothing about your topic, you have to be quite ruthlessly focused in how you write a story and recognize that you're not going to write the perfect nuanced story. And it's better to get 70% of the truth rather than aim for 100%, and for the most part your competitors will get 30%. But it's, you can't be a journalist without being willing to work with what's possible, not what's ideal.
What were the worst sort of compromises you had to make as being
The worst compromises were either pandering into stereotypes, because that was how you were going to basically write a piece that got accepted by the editor. Cultural stereotypes and things. Having to cut out a lot of the material that you'd gathered. So I'd go and talk to 20 people for a story and only 1 or 2 would get in. And often the other 18 had amazing stories and very human stories that I'd love to have captured. Those are some of the bigger compromises. Writing stories when you've only done a bit of research and then subsequently realise that what you wrote was, if not wrong, then very incomplete or misguided, misperceived. Those are, part of the approach of journalism.
What were the differences in information gathering techniques? Because in anthropology, as you know, the important things is the fieldwork diary, the notes, maybe photography and film and things like that. Is it the same with journalism?
As a journalist, what you're trained to do is to ask questions. And often you're so busy that you ask very directed questions. And these days you increasingly use press releases or text-based investigation on Wikipedia and the internet. And that is effective and efficient. The problem with it is that the self-directed nature of the questioning means that you often miss out part of the story by not seeing what you don't see. And one of the things that anthropology is fantastic at is trying to ask open-ended questions and look at what people don't talk about as much as what they do. And one of the issues that is very relevant for journalists is it trying to adopt and copy some of that anthropological approach. Doesn't happen enough, but it needs to happen.
Good. Well, we'll pursue this further, but let's go to the next. What happened then?
Well, so I was working at the FT, and I was basically a junior reporter, and I was going through the apprenticeship process, going up the system. And then after some time, I basically started off in a junior level. Then I got
specialising in Eastern Europe.
I was no. Originally, I was Eastern Europe, and then I was put into the economics team to train me up in economics. And in that position, I went from economics to essentially to. I did the money markets. Then I did I was writing the statistical column, and then I became the economics correspondent. Got a chance to go to Brussels for 6 months, and basically just kept hustling. And then a job came up in Japan, and so I went over to Japan and spent 5 years in Japan, where originally I was a deputy bureau chief, and then I became the bureau chief. And that was really my first big break as a journalist, because I arrived in Japan at the very moment that the financial crisis was starting. And
so what year is that?
That was 1997.
Right.
And I dived into it like an anthropologist, trying to immerse myself in the whole world of Japanese banking and finance. And I basically arrived at an interesting cusp moment, in that up until that point, the only journalists writing about Japanese banks were the Japanese media, and foreigners were kind of excluded. And at the moment that I arrived, they were just starting to open up a bit to foreigners. So I dived in, but I became really the first foreigner to write about what was happening inside the Japanese banking system in that way. And I say, as an anthropologist, it was fascinating, but the anthropology training really helped me, because it made me much more open-minded about trying to listen to what they were saying, not just talk myself.
Well, as you know, I've studied Japan a lot, and I was there in 1997 as a visiting professor at Tokyo. So
at Tokyo, oh, what a pity! Oh, Todai.
yeah, Todai.
Yeah.
So it's a pity we didn't meet.
Nihongo wakarimasu ka?
Sorry?
Nihongo wakarimasu ka?
I don't speak the word. Oh, well, just a word or two. But I remember being on the finance committee of King's College early on, and the bursar sort of tearing his hair out because he said, we have investments in Japan, but it's quite clear that their banking system and the investments and the whole economic system doesn't work in the way that it does here, so we can't predict anything. You know, there is something mysteriously. Later I met the chief minister of finance or economics in Japan, and we sorted out what I thought this was about, but you must have had that experience a lot.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I mean, as an anthropologist, we're trained to recognize that finance and economics is not a universal, you know, or the way that we imagine the economic system is not universal. Money is not like gravity in the sense that it's, you know, I mean, actually these days we know that even gravity isn't universal. It's a function of context and place. So perhaps money is like gravity. But many financiers talk about money and the markets as if they are universal truths that are found everywhere and not context dependent. And going to Japan was a really powerful example of how and why money and financial systems are an expression of culture. And yes, you can use mathematics to work out values and things like that, but actually if you just use mathematics, you're missing half the picture. And the Japanese had a fundamentally different vision of money and finance from the vision that was being promoted by the neoliberal economic orthodoxies coming out of Washington. And so you had this huge culture clash all the time about what was happening.
I mean, if I put it that two of the differences, one is that the West, from Adam Smith onwards, has assumed profit maximization at the individual level is the goal of sane, rational human beings, whereas the Japanese don't have that assumption, that they are thinking in terms of other goods, other people and relationships. Is that a reasonable assumption about one of the differences?
Well, there are several differences. I mean, one of the differences I noticed between America and Japan is that the Americans have historically not had much sense of resource constraint. They don't think the pie is fixed. They always assume they can grow the pie, and if you run out of land in the east, you just go west, young man. And Japan, by contrast, knows very strongly that resources are finite, and there's always capacity constraint, and there's always a sense of having to share out the pie in a way that's perceived to be equitable to maintain social cohesion. That's very strong. The Japanese also have a vision that actually money is something which is a reflection of relationships and creates relationships rather than sitting outside relationships. And when it comes to deciding how to allocate money, one of the starkest differences that I noticed in 1997 was that in the Japanese banking world, traditionally, they would either give you money or they wouldn't give you money. And there wasn't a sense of grading the price of money according to the risk. So you either got money cheaply or you got no money. And people who wanted to get money who couldn't get loans had to go outside the entire banking system into the consumer finance sector. But the idea of having a yield curve for risk didn't exist. Whereas, of course, in America, or the Anglo-Saxon model, measuring the value of a, not so much relationship, but a strategic investment, and trying to work out the risk and price for that is absolutely the bedrock of how they see finance. So that kind of difference was very fundamental to how the clash between Japanese and American bankers developed. And so to illustrate that, what I did was it's in my first book called Saving the Sun. I actually focus on one bank called Long-Term Credit Bank, or Shinsei, and I knew the Japanese bankers there very well, because I met them almost as soon as I arrived. And in 1998, Shinsei was originally one of the very strong banks, and then it fell into big problems. And in 1998, its leadership forged an alliance briefly with a foreign firm to try and save themselves, and then they collapsed completely. So I followed that story very closely from the Japanese perspective, spent many hours talking to them. And then a private equity group from America came in, of Wall Street financiers, and they bought the Japanese bank. And I got to know them very well too, so I had both perspectives. And then they put someone in charge who was Japanese but had lived in America for years, who was kind of a bridge, if you like. So my first book was literally about these three different perspectives, and I told this story like a narrative. I don't know if you've seen that book, but it was basically...
What's this book called?
It's called Saving the Sun. It's written like a novel, but it's true. It almost killed me to write it, because it follows these three characters in the story. The last CEO of the Japanese bank, the brash, abrasive American private equity guy who came in to buy it, and then the person who tried to bridge the gap, who was a Japanese who'd lived in America for years. And so that was my attempt to try and explain the story of the culture clash.
Did he save the bank, the third one? Or bridge the gap?
I mean, it's an extraordinary story. Basically, so what happened when the bank collapsed is some of the senior old Japanese managers were thrown into jail, and some committed suicide, which was obviously incredibly traumatic. So when he came in, the bank was very traumatized, and you had these very brash, very insensitive Americans trying to tell them what to do. And the guy who came in, who was called Yashiro-san, he did a good job of putting the bank together and turning it around. He did forge a new strategy. It worked really well for a few years, and then the other Japanese banks copied it and basically did it better.
Oh, well, that's something.
Yeah.
I mean, as I recall, I worked out with the Minister of Finance and other economists and so on in Japan, was that the Japanese economy is divided into two parts. There's production and the labour force and the human consumption and so on side of it. And the production, in other words, how a factory works, is roughly analysable by Western models. That it's very efficient and so on. But once you get to employment and distribution and consumption, it's embedded in the anthropological sense. In other words, lifetime employment, and you have to look after your employees, and
absolutely.
So you can't apply strict economic cost-benefit analysis.
No.
Is that roughly right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a very strong sense that communities are bound together by more than transactions, and you need to have proper long-term relationships, and that's very deeply ingrained in the way the system works. During the Japanese financial crisis, the CEO of one of the big banks was talking to me about the question of social cohesion, and he said, you have to realize that in Japan, if the employee wage bill has to be cut by 20%, then everybody's salary is cut by 20%, including the CEO. Sometimes the CEO will take a 30% cut, whereas he was saying in England, if a company has to cut its salary bill by 20%, it might fire 20% of the workers. And in America, if a company has to cut its wage bill by 20%, it will probably fire 40% of the workers and pay the CEO twice as much. And that's a difference, but
Just one other point about, which was a very shock to me. As you'll recall from your undergraduate anthropology, anthropologists and legal historians make a big difference between status-based societies where human relations and so on matter, and contractual. And modern economics is based on the idea of contract, of agreement to do something, which is behind Adam Smith and so on. As I talked to my closest Japanese friends, it became more and more apparent that the idea of contract is utterly abhorrent to the Japanese. They said, for example, when we buy a house, of course, there's solicitors and people who draw up a contract, and we sign it, and then we throw it in the waste paper basket, because if the human relations break down, there's nothing that contract can do to protect you, and it's meaningless. When we hired a piano teacher for our daughter, we never dreamt of having any kind of contract. She just said, I'll do this, and you said, I'll do this, and so it's a relationship of a multi-stranded relationship, which can't be formalised into a single-stranded contract.
Yes.
And that was a shock when I first discovered it. Did you encounter that sort of idea?
Yeah, I mean, Japan was a place which was very frustrating if you wanted to do things fast and be efficient, in that you couldn't, do things without spending a lot of time with people and having many meetings and listening to people and engaging in what they called nemawashi, tending the roots and trying to work out what everyone was thinking and trying to read the mood overall. I used to find it very frustrating quite often dealing with Japanese companies and things. It is what it is. You can't really change that.
Well, it's such a fascinating topic. I'd like to do another interview about Japan, but just two final questions. What is it that you loved most about Japan?
Well, the crass answer is that I had a little cottage up in the mountains in Echikoizawa, a place called Tenjin-dara, near Minakami, and I would go up there almost every weekend. And in the summer I went hiking, and I went swam in the rivers, I went to onsen, and to me that was the real Japan that I loved most of all. And in the winter I skied madly, and I skied insanely, enthusiastically all the time. So that was one of the things, but that really gave me a different side of Japan, and I have my favourite onsen up in the Gunma-ken, in the area there. The other thing I loved about Japan was just the incredible, creativity, and the fact that you had this culture which operated on quite different norms from Western culture, but was as important as Western culture, if not sometimes more important. And you couldn't just patronise it or ignore it. And so many of the countries and cultures that were different from the West that anthropologists have studied have been less powerful. And this was a different culture that was as powerful as the West.
Well, that's, again, I'd like to talk about that more, because one of my grouses not grouses, but the weaknesses of anthropology is that, you can find these wonderful things, and then people say, well, how many people, have these beliefs and culture? And you say, well, it's only a few tens of thousands in some remote Amazonian jungle. But Japan's 120 million people with their equally interesting and very different views, and therefore it's a shock. It's a critique of us.
Completely.
Yeah. So those are a thing you really liked, and what did you dislike about Japan most?
The rules.
Which?
The rules.
The rules.
Yeah, spoken and unspoken rules. Yeah. The sense of having to always conform.
Yeah.
I was very lucky there because I used my PhD to call myself Dr. Tett.
Yeah.
One of the Japanese friends suggested to me before I arrived in Japan on the first time that I should always say, Dr. Tetto on my cards, Dr. Tett. And that allowed me to be neither male nor female, because if you were a young female in that situation, even as a gaijin, an outsider, they tended to talk to you in Japanese, talking down.
Yes.
And you were expected to use female language. But as, Dr. Tetto, I basically became free of any gender. And so they could reclassify me in their mind as a man. And that helped.
That's very interesting. I mean, when you said the rules, it's in some ways a very bureaucratic society. There are hundreds and hundreds of rules.
Yes.
Many of which are unimportant, but some you never know which are important and which are unimportant.
Exactly.
I had a friend who was the Nissan professor at Oxford, who used to go out, and we spent time with him once. He said he has a card index, and every day he writes down on a card one rule he's broken, so that he can learn all the mistakes he made. And then I went with him to the airport to meet his wife, and she came off into the lounge, and he went up and kissed her. And that is one of the biggest rules. You don't kiss in public, even your wife. So I told him to write another card on that. Okay, so we'll leave reluctantly Japan and come back. What did you do after that?
After Japan, I went to America for a year, or rather almost a year, and I wrote a book about Japan. And so I took a book writing sabbatical, and I had to do that because it was basically, the writing of my first book on Japan was the hardest book I've ever written. It required an enormous amount of research, and so I basically spent a year. Then I went back to London and was planning to, and I came off book leave and was planning to go to Iran to be a foreign correspondent in Iran. I was very excited because it was quite hard to get into Iran then, but I got a visa, and my then partner was going to go with me. And then I found out that unexpectedly I was pregnant, and although I was quite convinced I could have a baby in Iran, it was during the time when people were threatening Iran with missile strikes or something from the war. So I decided to stay in England and had to very sadly and reluctantly give up the Iran job, and got posted instead to a what seemed initially to be a totally unglamorous, awful role, which was what they called a Lex writer.
Yes, I wonder what that sounds like. Law to me.
Yeah. Lex is the column which comments on finance for the Financial Times. It used to be very dry, short, analytical notes, and they're anonymous, so no one knows who you are. So I thought, what on earth do I want to do that for? But it was the only job on offer, and because I was basically pregnant, I didn't have a lot of flexibility about my hours and things like that. So I took that. Then I went off on book leave. Then I went off and had my first child.
A daughter.
Yep. And then I came back after 6 months because we had a lot of maternity leave at the FT, and got back to the lexicon.
Is it possible to take off your glasses?
Sure. Are they shining back?
Yes.
Yeah. Got back planning to basically spend a week or two on Lex and then start lobbying for another job. And I was during my maternity leave, I was named as deputy head of Lex, which was kind of meaningless because it was a very small team and the head of Lex did everything. It was just a purely, symbolic titular post. And then literally on day 2 of my return, the head of Lex resigned. And so to my absolute shock, the FT said, right, well, you're the deputy, you're now in charge. And the way these things work. And I went, don't want to, but anyway. So I basically ran it for the best part of a year, and didn't enormously enjoy it, but it was a really good training for myself. Taught me a lot.
How many people did you have?
It was tiny compared to other teams I've run. It was 6 people, but each day we had to produce 3 or 4 notes commenting on what was happening each day. They were anonymous, and I was supposed to organise them to reach a common view on things. The people who worked on Lex were all very headstrong, very opinionated, very impossible.
They may watch this.
Yeah, they were impossible to control or organise, and it was pretty tough, but it worked. And so and also I was a new young mother, and the great thing about Lex was it was very regular hours. So I went in at 10, came out at 6 or 9 to 5, boom, done. That was, and then at the end of that, I got, after about a year and a half, I got fed up and said, I've got to move. And so I applied for lots of jobs, didn't get any of them.
All within the FT?
Yeah. So I tried to be economics editor. I was turned down because I didn't have a PhD in economics or BA in economics. Tried to be banking editor, lost that. Tried to be defence columnist, lost that. So literally 4 jobs in the row I was turned down for. And then this job called capital markets editor came up, which at the time was a real backwater and quite low status. And I thought, what the heck, I'll take it. And I'd written a memo while I was on Lex in which I was very critical about how the Financial Times covered the financial markets. And I basically argued that, the memo was called the iceberg memo. And I said that basically what you had in finance was a small part of the ecosystem poking above the water that was really visible and widely commented on. And then you had a large amount beneath the water that was hidden. And the stuff beneath the water was things like debt and credit and derivatives. And nobody wrote about that. And no one even paid attention to it, even though it was very, very big and driving most of the revenue in the City of London. And the stuff that the papers did write about were things like equity markets and currencies. And that mattered, but it was a small part. So I wrote a very critical memo about how we wrote about finance. And then on the basis of that, they said, okay, why don't you go and run the capital markets team? So I went across there in 2005.
2005?
Yeah.
Why do you think you saw this submerged part of the iceberg and other people didn't?
Purely because of my training as an anthropologist. And I put it straight down to Pierre Bourdieu, looking at social sciences, looking at what people weren't talking about, asking what was not being discussed, what sits outside the doxa. And on top of that, that was the main reason. Trying to look at things holistically, and trying to challenge the mental maps that we always have to make sense of the world.
One question that occurred to my mind, even with the Lex column, you're organising herding cats, 6 of them, and since then you've run, I don't know what the maximum number of people you were head of in your whole time at the FT. How many people did you have below you?
About 60.
About 60. To do it effectively, as you know, is an art in itself.
A lot less than I have now.
a lot less, but basically some people hate that kind of work, personnel administration work. Some people love it and some are in the middle. They'll do it because it's obviously necessary. Where do you lie?
Middle. I do it because it's necessary. I don't particularly want to boss people around. But what I do like is trying to build projects and teams and chase a goal as a group. I think I often have quite a strong sense of, vision or strategy or big picture. I like mentoring and monitoring younger people and trying to give them wings. So, for that reason, I will do it. But I find a lot of the bureaucracy maddening and frustrating.
And have you any tips for, it's too late for me, but for other people as to how best to do this kind of
Management? Be organised if you can. Create a window each day for your own work and yourself so you don't go mad. Try to be, fair and honest with people. Try not to play favourites. Be as open as you can to supporting everyone. Those are the key things.
And lead by example.
Yeah.
Otherwise they won't follow. Right. So, 2005 2005, we've got to. Is that when you went first to America? Or?
No. I was 2005. I joined the capital markets team. Total backwater. One of the first things, and I thought it was a terrible career move. I literally thought my career had gone down the toilet. I thought I'd gone on the mummy track because I was pregnant again, and so, I really thought, right, I'm getting totally sidelined within the FT. And I arrived at this team in literally like 3 people, and we were in about the most furthest reach in the newspaper from the main news desk. And I remember turning up, and the people were lovely, but they were, one of them was about to retire, and one of them was a graduate trainee. It's like really kind of, not in the mainstream part at all. And so I remember saying to them on the first day, right, we've all got to get out and start talking to real life bankers. We can't just sit in our desks and do press releases. So to lead by example, I said, right, I'm going off to this conference next week, which I found in my inbox, and went off literally on the first week to this big derivatives conference down in the south of France, and went there and was absolutely shocked by this kind of subculture I found. It's a bit like Japanese banking all over again, but this time it was derivatives traders, and basically used exactly the same skills I'd used to deconstruct Tajik wedding rituals to try and understand the banking conference. And that was one of the things that started me on this path to try and deconstruct complex finance, and which also enabled me to see the risks that were building in it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. What shocked you? I mean, was it that they weren't aware of the risks that they were taking, or was it that?
Well, what struck me going into the conference was, firstly, you had a really clear-cut sense of a tribe. And I joked at the time that a Tajik wedding ritual was just like an investment banking conference, in that you had this big stylistic, ritualistic event which was pulling together a scattered group of people and using both formal and informal rituals to not just recreate their social ties, but also to recreate a shared worldview, which is really obvious stuff in anthropology. And when I looked at the worldview that they were creating, one thing that was very clear was that they were using a language that no one else understood and nobody else expected to understand. They kept saying that they didn't feel anyone in their bank understood them. They kind of had more in common with each other, even though they were living in Singapore and Tokyo and New York and things. And they were very connected by virtue of Bloomberg terminals. They were all part of what I call the Bloomberg village. And they sort of had this evangelical messianic zeal about what they were doing. They dressed it up in this very evangelical language about, we are saving consumers, we're helping spread liquidity, we're creating perfect free markets. And they sort of almost believed it. I mean, it's part of this kind of...
Almost believed it?
Well, I don't know. You never know what's on belief. But certainly at the time, it looked as if they had concocted this creation mythology, which... subsequently was rubbish, but at the time seemed to be very widely held. And the great thing, again, as an anthropologist, is that, anthropologists know that every community has a creation mythology and a shared story and a shared cognitive map that's full of contradictions, if not lies. But, as Upton Sinclair says, it's very hard to get a man to understand if his job depends on not understanding. And in this case, I think the bankers did believe it. And they were kind of worshipping at the cult of liquidity, perfectly liquid free markets. There's a wonderful anthropologist called Karen Ho who wrote a book about this and called Liquefied. And she said that, there's this complete obsession, this cult of worshipping liquidity, perfect free markets.
What does liquidity mean?
It means the ability to trade assets freely.
Oh, I see, yeah.
So they can be freely traded.
No transactional cost.
No, they're freely traded. And the idea is if you have a perfect free market where everything trades everything, you get the perfect price for every risk. So it's back to my idea that in Japan, money is either given or not given, but there's no pricing adjustment. In Anglo-Saxon culture, the more that you get a market that's functioning and liquid and tradable, the idea is that everything will be priced according to the level of risk. That's the theory. So that's basically what they were doing.
So it's a sub-tribe of the neoliberal idea that the market can be made more or less perfect and so on. And when you said you...
And it was full of contradictions. I mean, to give two examples, if you looked at what... they said they were doing all this to reduce risk in the system, and all of their innovation was to cut risk. But the problem was that they were creating systems of trading which were so complex and no one understood them. So that was injecting more risk in the system. Similarly, they said that they were doing all this to create perfect mark-to-market accounting. And in reality, the products they were creating were so complex you couldn't trade them and you couldn't mark them according to market prices. So they were using models to price them. So subsequently, you could look back and say the whole thing was completely contradictory. But they couldn't see it because they, like any group that anthropologists study, had this creation myth, which was very convenient to believe. It justified the hierarchy. It gave them a sense of self-worth. And they had a shared cognitive map, which meant that they kept everyone else out, and they were the only ones who could understand it.
Well, one of the functions of language in these cases, for example, technical language and jargon, is explicitly to keep people...
Completely.
And that's what
I used to joke the bankers were like the priests in medieval Catholic Church who spoke financial Latin, and the congregation did not understand it, but they basically sat there dumbly because the incense was waved and the Pope was blessing everything. And in the same way, bankers in 2007 were speaking financial jargon no one understood, but the congregation thought this is fantastic because consumers were getting cheap loans, and Alan Greenspan had blessed it, so no one challenged it. So basically after that, so I went to this conference, became very alarmed, very fascinated, came back and decided to spend a year of my life writing a travel guide to the world of financial innovation. So I did that, and then became very, very concerned about how the financial system was spinning out of control.
Did you publish that?
Oh yeah, I wrote lots of articles. Yeah, illuminating it. Then I became convinced that there was going to be a crisis. That was in late 2005, and I went off maternity leave for my second child and told everyone that my timing was dreadful because I thought the crisis would happen while I was gone. And it didn't. I came back in 2006, and the financial markets had become even crazier and even more extreme. So initially I thought, God, I got everything wrong. There hasn't been a crisis. I'm wrong. I didn't understand it. And then after 2 months, I kind of flipped again and went, no, actually, I'm right. They're crazy. The system is mad. And I wrote a series of articles basically warning of, a financial crisis. And I got attacked a lot by the bankers for that. And, on a couple of occasions felt very overwhelmed and quite scared.
Did the FT try and put any pressure on you not to write this sort of stuff?
No, never did. No, they were very good. We were still sitting in the really obscure part of the FT. We were so totally outside the radar. We literally sat next to the trash cans in the basement. Structurally, it was quite important because economics was the high status glory part of the FT, and they had offices overlooking the river and next to the editor's office, and that was like very high status and visible, and that's where I'd been initially. So that was like the glory part. And the capital markets team was like literally in the basement overlooking the trash cans, and no one ever paid us any attention unless I went out and yelled at them. And historically no one had, and it was amazing because basically I had this initially a four-strong team, and then there was another team next to me, and so I made a pact with the head of the other team to reorganize our teams completely, and no one even noticed. And so I kind of basically just built this kind of little mini group and very much fashioned it to my vision. And And, once a day I'd pop out of my little hole and go and talk to the news editors and say, right, please can we do X, Y, and Z? And they'd often go, oh God, that sounds weird and boring. But quite often they'd go, okay, fine. And then gradually we began to get more and more attention in the marketplace for what was happening. And then the financial crisis happened, and suddenly we became Flavour of the Month. Because we were pretty much the only team that was writing about it in advance and which had predicted the crisis.
Can you explain a puzzle in your Wikipedia, the article on you in the Wikipedia, where it says you gained renown from this work on predicting the coming global crisis, but there, according to the Wikipedia, all attempts to find...
Oh yeah, that is really interesting, because that's actually been since changed. I saw that the other day. There are people out there who definitely don't like me, and my Wikipedia page has been vandalized quite a few times, and I don't check it very often because I really don't want to read about myself. But
there are contemporary articles.
Oh yeah. What's happened? I can show you, because actually I saw that about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And basically asked my colleagues at the FT, and they've now changed the Wikipedia page to cite all the articles I wrote.
Good.
Predicting it. So
it seemed a bit strange because.
Yeah, it happens. Believe me, it's not.
It's all right. Well, I don't need evidence.
I have a thick skin. No, because actually, it's actually. I'll just double check. It still is the same.
Because I typed out your Wikipedia today, and it still said it's.
No, today.
Yeah.
Okay. It.
Before I came to you.
Was that today, or because it says here? Did you go on my Wikipedia today, this morning?
I thought so. Or maybe yesterday, but maybe yesterday or the day before.
It might have been last week, because it now says she's written about the financial instruments were part of the cause of the financial crisis that started in the fourth quarter of 2007. She became renowned for her early warning that a financial crisis was looming, and there are 4 or 5 references now.
Great.
To
well, that's that's fine. What you were discovering. Well, 2 questions about that. One is that you found they were speaking this language which no one else understood. How long did it, as an anthropologist, take you to understand that language?
How long did it take? I mean, like anything, quite a long time. I had to put a wet towel over my head and just concentrate. But I had to do that when I first joined the FT and joined the economics team. And I didn't understand economics, and that was another type of jargon. So learning financial markets jargon was just like another type of jargon, really.
And the second question is that you've written a book called The Silo Effect, and I think it may have been then that you really came across the idea of silos and insulation and isolation of groups and how it impeded creativity and so on. Is that right? Absolutely.
And actually I became aware of silos because of the financial crisis, in the sense that before, when the crisis happened, there was a widespread perception by journalists and politicians that somehow the bankers that had caused it had been evil and greedy and mad, and I just felt that was wrong, because the people I knew, or stupid, were not stupid at all. And they weren't mad, and they weren't, generally speaking, deliberately evil. They were quite often greedy, but that's, human nature. And I realized that the people who were made really dumb mistakes in finance were often trapped in a social system and a structure and a cognitive system which made them unable to join up the dots and see the consequence of what they were doing. They literally just saw their own little patch in front of their noses. So I kind of thought, this is absolutely insane, and so I wrote a book about the crazy silos that existed inside finance and how and why they'd made the financial crisis much worse.
Do you think the anthropological finding that you go to a culture which behaves in a crazy way, and previously everyone said they're mad and there's no logic to it, but the art of anthropology was to see what the inner logic was, and that these people are not villains and heathens, that they have their own system, and how could they think otherwise, more or less? inside that system. Do you think that a central insight of anthropology was helpful?
Absolutely. It's all about trying to see the world through other people's eyes and seeing the context and the environment.
My only sort of not criticism really, but reflection on the silo effect and your frequent references to silos is that...
And by the way, it can be criticism. You're being very polite. I've had lots of people be very rude to me over my life.
No, it's just that functionally silos are necessary.
Completely.
And the art is to get enough of a silo effect to protect you against the vagaries of fortune and so on, but not to make it so strong that fresh ideas and contacts and reality cannot impinge on it.
Absolutely, could not agree more. And actually in my book, The Silo Effect, I write a lot about the benefits of silos. Because silos are inevitable. They're part of human life. We are drowning in information all the time, and people and processes and things, and we cannot operate without some kind of taxonomy to sort stuff out. We need a way of sorting out our sock drawer. We need a way of sorting out our minds. So silos are inevitable. We need a classification system. And I would argue that classification is culture and culture is classification. That is at the root of the whole thing. And silos can create accountability, they can create speed, they can create innovation. They allow people to move fast as groups. The problem comes when a silo is set up in a way that's so rigid that it stays like this even as the world around it changes. And that's a danger point.
Well, I thought of a useful phrase which I learnt from a very close friend who was an industrialist, a very successful industrialist. And his idea, he was very interested in creativity and so on, and he came up with this phrase, bounded but leaky.
Yeah, exactly, that's brilliant.
So you need the boundedness, but you need, and if you look at the history of scientific growth and so on, all scientists have their boundedness, but then they have sufficient porousness. And
they innovate at the edge of those boundaries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the weaknesses of Japan, because it tends to be too bounded and not leaky enough.
Well, one of the stories in my book is about Sony, which basically created the Sony Walkman.
Yes.
Truly brilliant.
You've read the biography of Mr. Sony.
Yeah. So they created Sony Walkman, but then they created these rigid different departments that couldn't collaborate. And because they couldn't collaborate, although Sony had software, hardware and music and consumer products and design all sitting inside Sony. So it should have been the company that dominated the era of digital portable music. Because they were so segregated, they couldn't collaborate, and so Apple came in and created the iPod.
That's interesting. Well, we're just about at the end, and in a way we're, as I hope to think, about halfway through the financial times bit, and then there's all the rest of your life to deal with. Shall we end there? And we've got to what, 2009?
Sure. Absolutely. Well, 2010, I'll just say the last bit at 2010, this is going to be the cliffhanger for the next session. So I basically do the financial crisis. I go from being this, maverick in the basement, constantly trying to yell at the world and getting ignored, and then gradually getting traction. And then the financial crisis happens, and suddenly I become flavour of the month. In a way that's actually ridiculous, because I went from, being here to there. And in fact, everyone exaggerated what I'd said. I didn't predict the entire financial crisis at all. I really didn't. What I did do, though, was say that something was going badly wrong. But, in the way these things work, is suddenly the, high priests of journalism woke up and decided that they felt guilty about journalism not having seen the financial crisis before. So I was the one person they could point to practically and said, oh yeah, she saw it. So they gave me lots of medals and blah, 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 awards and that, which was very nice. But, in some ways undeserved. But that was, so whatever. And on the back of that, then I got promoted again in the FT. And then I got asked if I wanted to go to America. And do what was really a very big promotion, which was to be promoted to run the American operation of the FT. And that was kind of like a shock, but also very exciting. So that was my jump into management.
Let's have the jump next time.
Okay, fantastic.
I did talk to, I've done a long set of interviews with Vince Cable.
Oh, great, he's wonderful. And he and I used to talk a lot.
And he claimed that he'd also...
Yeah, he had. He was one of the few politicians who talked about it.
Good.
Yeah, he's absolutely correct. Yeah. Vince and I actually did quite a lot of panels together in 2008 and 2009 because we were like exhibit A of people. And again, it's like everything. I absolutely did not predict the scale of the crisis or the consequences. Not a bit of it. I just was going, this is kind of mad what's happening. But the way these things are, it goes back to the compromise in journalism, is that people are always trying to frame you into a box and a stereotype quickly. So I went from being weirdo maverick to the prophet, and neither were true. But that's part of life.
Well, that's a lovely ending. So I'm going to stop there.